Okay, we are going to start in this video with Chapter 6. So we have had an introduction to the skeletal system, so you've learned most of the bones back in Chapter 7, and so now we're going to look at the bone and the bone tissue. So we start by giving you some functions of the skeletal system. Most of these you probably already know. The first one is the easiest, the protection. We all know the skeletal system provides protection for very important organs. The skull provides protection for your brain. The rib cage provides protection for your heart and lungs. Also, mineral storage and acid-base balance. The skeletal system stores two really important minerals like calcium and phosphate, and these are necessary to keep your electrolytes balanced as well as your acid base. Blood cell formation. This is the site of red bone marrow. That's where blood cells are actually made, is in that red bone marrow. Fat storage, yellow bone marrow stores triglycerides. Movement, obviously the skeletal system provides a place for muscles to attach so that we can move. And then support, it gives us shape and it supports the weight of our bodies. Okay, so we're going to look at bone structure first. Bone structure can be organized into 5 different classes. Regardless of the appearance, all 206 bones fit into at least one of these categories, and they're based on the shape. So the first category are long bones. These are named for the overall shape, not their actual size. Basically, they're longer than they are wide. This is most bones in your arms and legs. Then you have short bones. Again, this is named for shape rather than size. These are normally cube-shaped. They're usually about as long as they are wide. Your bones of the wrist, your carpals, as well as your tarsals are examples of short bones. And then we have flat bones, thin, broad, your ribs, your pelvis, your sternum, breastbone. Most of the bones in your skull fall into the flat bone category. Then we have irregular bones, and these are bones that basically don't fit anywhere else because they're very irregular. Your vertebrae, a lot of your internal skull bones fit into this irregular group. And then you have the sesamoid, and these are specialized bones that are located within the tendons. They're usually small and flat. They give the tendons an advantage mechanically, and it gives the muscles a little bit better leverage. Your patella, which is your kneecap, is an example of a bone in this particular class. Okay, so let's look at the structure of a long bone. We start off by looking at the periosteum. This is basically the outer covering. It surrounds the outer surface of the long bone, and it's very rich with blood vessels as well as nerves. Now, the perforating fibers, or the Sharpie's fibers, are underneath that. They anchor the periosteum firmly to the bone surface underneath that by penetrating pretty deep down into that bone matrix. Then you have the diaphysis. The diaphysis is the shaft. It is the long shaft of the bone. At the end, where you have the rounded part, is called the epiphysis. The epiphysis is usually covered with a thin layer of hyaline cartilage. We call this articular cartilage because it's found within the joints between bones. You're going to learn very quickly in the next chapter that the word articulation means joint. So anytime you see that, you know we're dealing with a joint. But right here where my mouse is, this would be the epiphysis on this end, and then you have another one on this end. And then, of course, through the shaft here would be your diaphysis. Within the diaphysis is a hollow cavity right here, and that's where you have your marrow. It's either going to have red marrow or yellow marrow, depending on the age of the bone of that individual. Okay, a little bit more structure on the long bone. You have compact bone, and this is that. There's basically one of 2 bone textures, compact and spongy, and the compact is the hard outer region. This allows bone to be resistant in linear compression as well as other stresses, even twisting forces. So this is when you think of bone, you think of a hard substance, and this is what you're thinking of, is the outer compact bone. But within that, you have a second kind of texture called spongy bone, and it's inside that compact bone. It really looks like a sponge. It has a honeycomb like framework, and this allows the bones to resist forces from many different directions, and it also provides a cavity for that bone marrow. So here's a picture. Here is your compact bone on the outside, and then underneath that you have the spongy bone. Okay, the bony struts of that spongy bone and all those inner surfaces are covered by a membrane called endosteum. The endosteum has a lot of different populations of bone cells that are involved in that bone homeostasis. Another structure of a long bone is the epiphyseal line. This is found separating the proximal and the distal epiphysis from the diaphysis. This is basically a scar or a remnant of the epiphyseal plate, which you probably have heard called your growth plates. In children, obviously we know the bones are developing a lot in children and they're growing in size. The epiphysis and the diaphysis actually are separated by a line of hyaline cartilage. This cartilage allows the bone to grow in length. And so as the bone grows in length, that cartilage gets thinner and thinner and thinner until finally it all turns into bone. And then you have what we call the epiphyseal line, which is almost like a bone scar. Okay, so now we'll look over at the structure of short, flat, irregular, and sesamoid bones. They do not have a diaphysis, epiphysis, medullary cavity, epiphyseal lines, or plates, okay? But they do have periosteum. They're covered by periosteum that again have those perforating fibers, the blood vessels, and the nerves, just like the long bones do. The internal structure is going to be made up of that spongy bone. Sometimes we call it diploe. There's also bone marrow there, so you basically have the two outer layers of thin compact bone, and then you have the middle layer of spongy bone. Some of the flat and irregular bones have sinuses. These are hollow air-filled spaces, and this is going to help reduce the bone weight. As you can see, that periosteum is this outer covering here. Here are those perforating fibers. All right, we looked Sharpie's fibers, the other word we looked at there on the other slide. And then you have the compact bone on the top and on the bottom, and then you have your spongy bone in the center, and this particular bone has red bone marrow. Okay, the blood and nerve supply to the bone. The remaining 2/3 is supplied by a nutrient artery. The nutrient arteries enter through a small hole in the diaphysis, which is called the nutrient foramen. The nutrient arteries bypass the compact bone and they supply the internal parts of the bone. Your epiphysis receives some blood supply from the nutrient arteries, and the majority of that does come from those small blood vessels. Okay, red bone marrow. You have two types of bone marrow, red and yellow. Red bone marrow is mainly loose connective tissue, and it has a lot of blood-forming hemopoietic cells. And those are basically cells that form red blood cells. The amount of red bone marrow decreases as a person ages. Children need a lot more red marrow because they're doing a lot more growth and development. The red marrow in adults is only found in your pelvis, the proximal femur and humerus, vertebrae, ribs, the sternum, your clavicles, the scapula, and some of the bones in your skull. And then, of course, yellow bone marrow is mainly just a fatty storage. It has triglycerides, the blood vessels, and, of course, those fat cells. We will stop there. In the next video, we'll pick up with the microscopic bone structure.